everyone. Um, Welcome to our third and semester examining, redefining foundational rhetoric. Sorry, my power just went out. Today we have Dr. Aimi Hamraie with us and giving a lecture on critical access and how disability culture can inform design, practice, and pedagogy. Dr. Hamraie is an associate professor of medicine, health and society, and American studies at Vanderbilt University, where they also direct the Critical Design Lab. Their research is centered in critical disability studies, design, and science and technology studies. They are the author of Building Access, Universal Design and the Politics of Disability, a history of the universal design movement that was published in 2017. And their next book, Enlivened City, addresses new urbanism, livability, and disability politics. Dr. Hamraie, we're so excited to have you here today, and I'm very
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Hey, my name is Aimi Hamraie, and I work at Vanderbilt University, where I teach in the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, which is basically an interdisciplinary pre-med major, but instead of the students just learning kind of biology and chemistry, they also are required to take courses in the built environment, in the sociology of medicine and health. And so my role there is to teach disability studies and also to teach courses on the built environment. And I also run a lab called the Critical Design Lab, which is comprised of disabled designers and design researchers. And we do all of our work from a disability culture perspective. I also want to say that I'm joining you from the ancestral homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi people. And that anytime we're talking about accessibility, access to public space, we're also in the United States talking about land that has been stolen from Indigenous people. And it's our responsibility to recognize that and also to work to support Indigenous sovereignty and to name that violence that has happened. A few accessibility notes about my talk. So I'm going to be showing slides and I will describe the images for accessibility. On this slide here, there's a photograph of an image that I found when I was writing my book, Building Access. And it's a photograph from the 1970s. It shows three people in the lobby of the Taylor Business School. Two of the people are standing and one person is seated in a wheelchair. That person is the architect Ronald Mace, who's the founder of the Universal Design Movement. And Mace himself took this photo and then drew on it a kind of proposal for an accessible vestibule in this building, which has, it says things like, there should be call signals that have lights and sounds, so they're accessible to deaf people and blind people. This is what the height should be. This is what the width of the door should be. And for me, this represents this idea that accessibility is not just one thing. It's not a standard, although standards exist. But really, people, especially disabled people, have been experimenting with the idea of accessibility and collaborating and coming up with new modes of designing for 70 or 80 years now. And we're all part of that history too. Many of us, were alive for the Americans with Disabilities Act, or maybe kind of just as it was passed. So my talk today is going to give a historical overview of accessibility and how it came to exist and why it's necessary. And then I'm going to look at some examples of kind of more critical and cultural approaches to access. So typically, when we talk about accessibility, we might imagine something like the two images I'm showing on the slide. One is like a wheelchair ramp with aluminum handles, it's concrete, it's going across a wall. And then one is a curb cut, which is a type of ramp that goes from the sidewalk to the street, and it has these sort of raised yellow bumps on it. And very often if someone says, is the building accessible? Is the street accessible? This is the first kind of thing that we look for. And if it's there, someone may be like, oh yeah, it's totally fine. But access has much deeper meanings than this. These are tools for mobility accessibility. And not all disabled people have mobility access issues, although many people do. And they tend to assume that there are standard needs and standard types of disabled people. And in my scholarship, I work alongside a number of others who take a critical approach to accessibility and to a field of access studies, which means that we question some of the assumptions that are circulating around accessibility. We don't treat it as something that is unproblematic or that can be achieved in standard ways. So we raise questions, for example, about the relationship between disability and race in public space. We talk about things like, does this type of access require that someone have gainful employment and be a productive worker? And what might be some of the problems with that? Or is this type of access very centered in the United States and our conceptions of disability in the US? And so today I'm going to talk about some critical approaches to access that come from my scholarship and also from the work that we do in my lab. The first kind of historical story I want to examine, because this is a speaker series that's about the foundations of architecture, is where the concept of the architectural user or the inhabitant comes from and how this relates to disability. So this is sort of a question of what was it that made it necessary to eventually have accessibility laws and standards in the United States. On this slide on the left, I'm showing a scan of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, which is, of course, part of the iconography of both architecture and medicine. It's this sort of white, apparently male body with arms extended into space, with these certain geometric proportions, based on an account by the Roman architect Vitruvius in 15 BC, who basically was following Greek sculptors in believing that human bodies have standard proportions that are also the most beautiful proportions that reflect the golden ratio. But this is like a very specific type of body. It's not a universal body. It's a very kind of like white, male, strong, able-bodied standard body. On the right, I'm showing some drawings that are labeled Dimensions of the Human Figure. And these were the drawings that architects, at least in the US, the ones who used the architectural graphics standards, from 1941 to 1981, the only information they had about users and inhabitants was contained in these images. And so what is being shown here is similar to the Vitruvian Man. There are bodies, they're shaded black. They look like kind of like gender neutral bodies, but I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And they're doing all sorts of stuff. They're standing, climbing, sitting, crawling, reaching out into space. And next to them are these little dimensional notations that specify kind of like height and width and things like that. There's also, interestingly, this random shoe here that has a smaller footprint than this foot here. And this shoe is supposed to indicate female embodiment. And so if that wasn't there, we might just look at this image and say like, oh, this is just like a standard human. But actually, it's not standard because they're recognizing that there is some sort of like sex difference in body size for some people, but not even through the representation of a whole body, just this shoe. So if you were an architecture student between 1941 and 1981, this would have been on the last page of the graphic standards, like at the end of the entire book, and it would have been your reference for human figure. There's another kind of source of information about users that's wrapped up with the history of disability and the field of scientific management, which gave way later to industrial design. And this was data about users as what is now called the human factor. And since pretty much like the 1850s, the term human factor was used to describe the way that you can build a factory to have really standard operations, but how the people in that factory behave and how efficiently they work is going to create a lot of variation. And so the user was a concept that what was basically how industrial managers talked about like the chaos in a system. And they wanted to study it and measure it and make it more predictable. So on this slide, I'm showing us a photo of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who are two scientific managers. They invented time motion studies. They did a motion study for the handicapped in, I think that says 1920. And so they worked with a veteran.
Amy, it looks like we lost you. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we'll need you to sign off and sign back in. I think it may have just lost you for a second. Hi, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We're working to get Amy back online.
Hi everyone, sorry we are testing if the camera is working. Okay, Amy joined back. There we go.
Yeah. Sorry, my power went out. We've had some storms here in Nashville, and very sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna pick back up now on where I was. Okay. So can you all see my slides?
Yes, they're back.
Okay, great. So Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, they did these motion studies of disabled people in the 1920s and beyond, and they worked with rehabilitation engineers to basically work for disability rights, but specifically for the purpose of returning disabled people to productive employment. And so even though they were kind of trying to diversify the idea of the user, they were doing it through a very specific framework, which is a capitalist framework. And this is one that disability activists would later challenge. All of this is part of a phenomenon that in my book, Building Access, I call the normate template for design. So the word normate is a disability studies concept, and it points to that kind of Vitruvian man figure. So it's like a shorthand for like white, male, able-bodied person. And there are many examples of this in the history of design, especially in the 20th century. One of them is what I'm showing here on the slide. There are two sets of images of bodies that are anthropometric. So they're drawing on data about population sizes that was collected by eugenicists. The male data came from Army veterans, and the female data came from housewives who were measured by basically like the Department of Home Economics. And the images on the left are of these two marble sculptures that were created using this data by eugenicists. And then they would take them around to like fairs and stuff, and people would come and they would compare their bodies to them, and whoever had the closest body would win. And it was in promotion of this idea of a kind of like white, strong, non-disabled kind of type of citizen. On the right, there's a man who's named Alvin Tilley. He worked for Henry Dreyfuss Associates, an industrial design firm. He took that same data, more or less, and he drew Average Joe and Average Josephine. These two figures that are just line drawings of bodies with dimensional notations. And these were then published in a book called Design for Man and Woman, out in the 1960s. And I like showing this image with Tilley because he's the one who drew them, and he doesn't look anything like either one of them because they're not real people. He's kind of like this young white guy wearing khakis and sort of like a billowy button-up shirt. And he's definitely shorter than Joe. And it sort of shows the difference between like an ideal body type and a real body. And all of these were shaping the conception of the user. So disability access laws and research came in the 1950s and 60s, when after World War II, there were all of these veterans coming back from war. And there were also a lot of disabled civilians because of the polio epidemic. So at the University of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, they did all of this research on wheelchair users to create new anthropometric data. They wanted to figure out how much space a wheelchair needs to turn, how hard it is to go up and down a ramp, and all of this stuff. So the image on the left here shows Timothy Nugent, who is the director of a rehabilitation program at this university, outside next to this prototype ramp that could be adjusted to go up and down. And there's someone in a wheelchair going up the ramp who's a veteran who then became a student. And then the image on the right shows a prototypical accessible kitchen for the disabled housewife. And there's a white woman wheelchair user in this kitchen. And these were the two sorts of figures that shaped accessibility standards, the veteran and the housewife. And they, basically like these specific bodies were part of this research. But then standards were created, and those standards were exported all around the world as if they were universal standards. And what's really important to know about the University of Illinois at this time is that even though it wasn't in the South, this was a time of racial segregation, even in Illinois. And so the students who were part of this research would have been majority white. When the campus became really accessible, it was still only accessible to white disabled students. And that's something that we have to recognize and talk about when we talk about histories of access. So the first accessibility code, ANSI A117.1, was published in 1961. I'm showing the cover of it on the right here. And a bunch of stuff happened after this code was passed. So this code was not created by architects or by disability rights activists. It was created by rehabilitation professionals. And they published it. And then in 1965, Congress created the National Commission on Architectural Barriers, which was headed up by two architects. And then the next year, the AIA started a project. So in 1966, the AIA allocated $60,000, which is a huge amount of money in 1960s inflation rates. They allocated $60,000 to understand how do architects think about accessible design and how do we teach and promote it better. So they did a nationwide survey. They created all these educational resources. They tested them at conferences, at local AIA chapter meetings. And what they were basically doing was critiquing the foundations of architectural practice. You know, this is like quite a while ago, like 60, 70 years ago, that all these different things were happening. And they were experimenting with this question of what's the best way to present this information? Do we say that design, accessible design is designed for disabled people? Or do we say that architects in architecture programs should learn to design for the real rather than the imagined user with average physical and mental characteristics? So the idea of like the real user here was pushing back against those histories that I just showed you, but it also wasn't really using the word disability. So it wasn't, it didn't have like an identity politics behind it. At this time, that research found that architects seem to understand the needs of people with like high visibility disabilities, like people who use wheelchairs or canes. But that they didn't think that there were very many disabled people in the world, and they definitely weren't thinking about invisible disabilities like heart conditions or mental disabilities as part of access needs. And I think that that's still very much true today. And so what happened as a result of this research was that some architecture schools began to incorporate mostly kind of like rehabilitation approaches to accessible design. Another thing that happened, which I'm showing on the slide here, is that a conception of the disabled user entered the graphic standards in 1981, so 40 years after the previous image I showed. Data and figures created by Alvin Tilley and Henry Dreyfuss Associates appeared in the graphic standards. And so this is average Joe, but he's seated in a wheelchair. There's all this new data around him. And then there's also a person standing and walking a white cane to indicate blindness. This moved to the front of the book, at least in the 1981 edition. And that reflected some of these changes that were happening in architecture towards like thinking more about the human user of space. So those were the kind of like standard approaches that were emerging in the 80s, leading up to disability rights laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which passed in 1990. At the same time, there was a radical disability movement in places like Berkeley, California, that was emerging to challenge the rehabilitation profession. So this was people with a lived experience of disability saying, we deserve access regardless of whether or not we can work productively. And they created this movement called the Independent Living Movement, where there were these centers all over the United States that were staffed by disabled people. And they were really challenging the ability of doctors and rehab folks to, describe or know the needs of disabled people. And they were very politically active. So on this slide, I'm showing two images. The one on the left is a chunk of concrete from when activists took a sledgehammer and bashed up a sidewalk that was inaccessible. And then they poured a curb cut with a bag of cement during a protest. So they were doing design work, but they were also doing it during a protest. And on the right is the newsletter, the magazine of the Independent Living Movement, which shows two disabled people in a wheelchair or a power chair, and then two people kind of walking behind them, going up the first official curb cut in Berkeley. So this is kind of a story about activists doing these DIY curb cuts, and then eventually the state or the city responding by funding curb cuts themselves institutionally. The experimental history of design in the disability movement is really important, and I'll show just one example, which is this sketch for a ramp. So, there were no standards for wheelchair ramps. Nobody really knew what their slope should be or what kind of materials they should be made out of. And so this one is drawn by the activist Eric Dibner. It's kind of hard to see, but it's on lined paper, kind of like notebook paper in ballpoint pen. And it shows a ramp that can go into this house at this specific address in Albany. And it specifies the materials. And there's really interesting stuff here, like mixing deck paint with sand to create the kind of like grittiness and texture that you need to go up a ramp. And so like the picture on the very first slide that I showed, there's really this kind of experimental sensibility, like disabled designers trying to figure out what does access even look like, what are ways of creating it. And there really was often a focus on mobility access. The same people led protests and sit-ins, and if any of you have watched the film Crip Camp, you may be familiar with the 504 protest, which was at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, both in California and in DC. And disabled people sat in for 30 days and demanded accessibility laws and civil rights laws. So when the ADA passed, this is kind of what we got. The ADAG, the ADA Accessibility Guidelines. Here I'm just showing a screenshot of the directives on the slope of a ramp. And what you might notice from looking at this is it's very like bureaucratic, institutional. It cites the law at the top. It's like numbered, figure 14. It again has all these dimensions kind of attached to it. And this was at the same time trying to teach architects who may not have even learned about this when they were in architecture school because the law didn't exist, how to create a ramp. And it had to be really standard and technical. And after the ADA passed, there was this sense that architects were just doing the bare minimum, that they weren't going beyond the code. And so a few years later, in 1997, a group of designers and researchers got together at the Center for Universal Design in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they drafted the principles of universal design, which I'm showing here, this poster. And I will say there are at least 3 people I know of at Georgia Tech who are directly involved with this, and that's John Sanford, who directs CATIA, the Center for Assistive Technology and Environmental Access, Abir Malik, and Jim Mueller, and they all work in industrial design. But so what this group of people wanted to do was to create a set of principles that would encourage architects to think more creatively and go beyond the code, not just do the bare minimum. So the principles are on this poster that has like chartreuse and hot pink in the background. And it has all these examples illustrating different kinds of use. And it says equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. And these principles were really drawing not on architecture and architectural knowledge, but on ideas that were in fields like rehabilitation, industrial design, user experience, environmental design research, more like social science. And the reason why that is significant is that the knowledge base of architecture was not sufficient for designing for the range of experience. And so they were bringing in this kind of interdisciplinary framework for doing this. And it's interesting to me, and I was doing research on how they came up with these principles, that the first principle, which is equitable use, was the one that they added last. So they were like doing all this like really functional kind of guidance and prescription. And then at the end they were like, oh yeah, but it actually has to be equitable. That's what the spirit of, disability rights is, and they put that first. There is not an explicit reference to disability in these principles. And that is also, to me, very interesting because the focus was really kind of so much more on good function, that rights-based framework and the kind of identity of disability was sort of falling out of it. Along with these principles, beginning in 1993, 21 universities across the US participated in a project called the Universal Design Education Project. And at architecture schools, courses were taught, like this is a poster for the one at Pratt. It shows a wheelchair access symbol, and it says, those who can do, those who can't teach, teachers take the ramp. And basically, they were trying to develop methods for teaching about disability access and about universal design. And every single school did it totally differently, and then they evaluated how they did it. So there's a great book that kind of explains how that evaluation went. Some of the really important questions that came up in this process were like, is universal design focused on physical disability? Can it include mental disability? Should it focus on people who are unhoused, who have a very high rate of disability? Should it focus on race, on poverty, incarceration? Different people were asking these questions, often students in the studios. And what came out of that was like, for some people, more of a focus on disability understood in really narrow terms, and for some people, a focus on disability in a more intersectional framework. But primarily, and maybe because of the way that the principles were written, there's a really kind of like functional approach to this. So I just want to highlight an example of kind of what sort of result this had that was different than maybe what the ADA would have intended. So the ADA covers places of public accommodation, restaurants and government buildings and stuff. It doesn't cover private homes. So there's some universal design projects like the Universal Design Living Laboratory outside of Columbus, Ohio, that are really focused on the home. I'm showing a photo of it here. This is like a large, essentially a model home, but two people do live in it. It's a craftsman style house out in the suburbs, surrounded by a big lawn. It has this kind of stone and stucco facade and a drive-through. And the focus in this project is to show that universal design can be luxurious. So there's a real focus on luxury amenities, like having like a really nice looking house and having all of these different universal design products in it that show that. And this is very different than the idea that disabled people should have access to rights in public space, because this isn't a public space, or that disabled people on average tend to have less access to productive employment, or less access to money in general, or that disabled people are vulnerable to policing or surveillance. And so one version of universal design has been this kind of version that is really kind of focused on access to privilege. And also very functional, again, like having inside ways to attach grab bars to walls, or having like sinks at different heights, and things like that. So up until this point, I've been talking about kind of more typical approaches to accessibility. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about disability culture. And what I mean by disability culture is all of the stuff that happens creatively and otherwise when disabled people get together and do things like talk about access or create access for each other. This concept, for me, the way that I learned about it was through the disability justice movement. And here I'm showing two graphics. On the left, the principles of disability justice from the collective Sins Invalid. And these are principles that are meant to push beyond disability rights and the focus on employment and things like that. And so the principles that they bring forth for disability justice are intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, which would mean like solidarity between anti-ableism and anti-racism and anti-sexism, et cetera. Wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, which means like more than one type of disability included, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And the conception of accessibility in disability justice is very different than in disability rights. In disability rights, it's really based on function, like how can you do your job better? In disability justice, there's this idea that like everyone deserves access regardless of how productive they are. And so the graphic on the right comes from a campaign by Alice Wong and Mia Mingus and Sandy Wong that says access is, solidarity is, disability justice is love. And the O in love has a heart. And it's kind of this idea that access is a form of hospitality and not just something that like architects should begrudgingly create. There are kind of these precedents for disability justice, especially in terms of thinking about the disabled user not just as like a white veteran or housewife. One that I found really interesting in the archive was this architectural drafting table for students called the Huey Saturn. This is named after Huey Newton, the Black Panther, Black activist. And what this advertisement shows is like there's a kind of like androgynous white woman student using the same drafting table as a Black disabled man who's a wheelchair user and has an afro. And it's like, it basically says like whether you're disabled or non-disabled, like anybody can use it. So this is a type of proto-universal design language that came from before the 80s and 90s. But in the work of universal design and people like Ronald Mace, there are also, starting in the 80s and 90s, more depictions of disabled users as racialized. And so I'm showing a series of images here that include Black disabled people, like one person who is blind and using a white cane, one person who is a wheelchair user. And the reason why this was significant is because the disability rights movement had been led by white people very publicly for so long. And at the same time, people who are working on disability and thinking about housing and cities and all sorts of things, we're recognizing that not all disabled people are white, and that we have to talk about the intersections of race and disability. So this is part of disability culture too, this kind of intersectionality. Another type of practice, cultural space I want to highlight when I talk about disability culture is something like this photo of the Society for Disability Studies plenary. So this is a conference that happens every year in my field, disability studies. And what we see in this photo is there's an audience in a ballroom. At the front of the room, there are 4 seated presenters, and they're flanked by American Sign Language interpreters. There's a screen that shows the captioning for the whole audience, not just one person. And then the audience is seated in power wheelchairs, and also kind of hotel chairs. And this space is arranged in this way because in disability culture, we recognize that there are multiple types of disability in the room, and access is layered. Access to information, access to being in the space is layered. And that's considered a kind of like, access is love. It's a way of getting people together to do things. An architectural example that comes out of disability culture is the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California. This is a building that sits on top of the Ashby BART station, which is a public transit station. And if you're outside and you're looking in, there's this big glass facade, and there's this kind of red-orange ramp that winds around the central atrium. There's a big skylight above it, and it's visible from the outside. So instead of putting the wheelchair ramp at the back of the building, it's showcased. It's this aesthetic and functional element. And then on the wall behind it is a whole bunch of images from disability protests. And this building houses, various disability organizations that exist in the Bay Area. And so they were really bringing forward the aesthetics of access and creating opportunities for disability arts and culture kind of activities in the space. So I was really inspired by all of these dimensions of disability culture. And so my lab, the Critical Design Lab, which I mentioned earlier, we started to take a disability culture approach to thinking about accessibility in several ways. And so I want to share some of those projects with you. One of the projects was called Mapping Access. And essentially, when I first started teaching at Vanderbilt, when I arrived on campus, hearing from people that the campus was 100% ADA compliant. And this was used to say that, we don't need to have a disability cultural center, we don't need to make accessibility improvements, et cetera. And so I was thinking about, how do I change this, and who do I work with? And at the same time, a very common exercise for me and other people in disability studies to do in our classrooms is the accessibility audit. Sometimes people will take the ADA guidelines and audit a building. And what I wanted to do was basically to help people on campus think about what it would mean to go beyond the ADA, try to meet the ADA and also go beyond it. And so we had a series of, conversations with different people on campus, disabled students groups, the Women's Center, the LGBT Center, the Black Cultural Center. And we created a survey that reflected a kind of local standard for access. And it had all sorts of things on it. It was the bathrooms should be wheelchair accessible, and they should be accessible for trans people, and there should be all gender restrooms. There should be lactation spaces. We should think about chemical sensitivity and light and wayfinding. And we had these events called mapathons, and there's a poster advertising one of them here. And people would go out in groups, like the one with like 3 people shown here. They would have a survey, they'd have a tape measure, and they would go and survey the building. And then they would come back, and we would kind of enter their information digitally, and we had this map, and points would pop up, and we would kind of map the accessibility of the campus. And so what happened as a result of this was, like, people realized the campus is both not ADA accessible and not accessible in these other ways. And so the university was about due for a master planning process, which it does every 40 years. And it created a whole task force for planning the accessibility of the campus. And from that task force, we actually created a new building code that purportedly went beyond the ADA. So one of the really interesting strategies that they came up with on this task force, which I was on, and there were also architects and other people on campus, is that we had these 2 old historic buildings. They have these columns on the front. There's no elevator in either one of them. And it was really hard to figure out how to make them accessible. And so what they did was they devised the solution that we could re-landscape and also build a new building that would be a circulation space in between them. They would have cafe seating and like all this stuff. And so that's what they did. And it kind of, tells a story about this sort of modernizing and renovation and stuff. Something that's very interesting to me about this, though, from a disability culture perspective, is that this is what the interior of the building looks like. It has what you might think of as a kind of central staircase. The staircase is front and center. It's incentivized to take it. The elevators are in the back of the building. And this is because the building was also trying to meet the standards for the Living Building Challenge, which is a sustainability standard. And in that standard, there's a lot of emphasis on the stairs, promoting taking the stairs, which is culturally and functionally at odds with the imperative of access, or that other type of entrance that I showed, for example, with the Ed Roberts campus, where the ramp is the central feature. So even though this was supposed to be like a more, a building that enabled access, it ended up being like a monument to this staircase. And to me, that illustrated kind of the difference in the questions that we were asking. So here, I'm trying to kind of illustrate critical access as a methodology. And this is a protocol for critical questions that my lab created when we were devising the Mapping Access project. It's basically like a hand-drawn flowchart with all these questions. Like the first questions are like, where can I find X? Where's the accessibility data? And you might go to Google Maps, but then you may not really find what you're looking for. And you may kind of go back to the original question. And you may then ask questions like, what counts as access? For whom? Under what conditions? How do we map it? How do we train people to think differently about the environments that they see every day? And from there, we came up with these ideas like critical crowdsourcing, the idea that people can gather accessibility data, but they can simultaneously be questioning what counts as accessibility. And they can be challenging institutional narratives. They can be thinking about access through a feminist lens or a queer lens. And to me, this is kind of, the difference between what ended up happening through that accessibility task force and the type of critical access project that we want to approach, because one was really trying to be accountable and intersectional, and to center disability and to understand disability as a culture and as a framework. And the other was more kind of like meeting the standards, but then prioritizing a kind of inaccessible format. Another project that we have is called the Contra Podcast, and this is a podcast on disability and design. And we interview disabled designers and scholars But the other thing about it is that we experiment with different types of accessibility with the podcast. So a typical podcast form is sound-based, but ours not only have transcripts and kind of like these simple English summaries so they're more cognitively accessible, but sometimes they start with a text format and then we create the sound around that. So this is a kind of critical design approach that comes more from media studies, and it draws on methods from deaf design and design by blind people, and really kind of trying to question, like, what is a podcast even, and how do we simultaneously talk about disability access through a critical and cultural framework, and also materialize it in this project. The last one I'll just mention really quickly because it's an example of disability culture, and there's another one of these coming up soon that is partially hosted by Georgia Tech, actually, is a dance party called Remote Access that we started when COVID started. We were thinking about all of the different ways that disabled people use technology to participate remotely, even before the pandemic. And we wanted to showcase those and create a party where you come and you interact by doing live image descriptions or by captioning or contributing to ASL or looking at art. And we created this protocol, which is showed on the left, and there's this whole like social media thing around it. And what happens in these spaces is that we get a lot of opportunity to experiment with access, to understand access as emergent and not standard, and for people to communicate about access needs, and then on the spot to create like a whole new way of having a party within the party. So I'm going to stop there and just let you know you can read more about these projects on our website, www.mappingaccess.com. And thanks so much for hanging in there with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aimi. That was fantastic. Very important topics to bring up. For the attendees, if you have any questions that you'd like to bring up or like to spend some time with a question and answer session, please go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And Memo and I will read them out. And to start us off, I have a question, Dr. Aimi. And this kind of relates to the Mapathon that you brought up, that you guys do. So have you examined the role that sidewalks play in access to basic human needs like government buildings or basic amenities like banks and healthcare and food markets, and what the laws are around them and how they are mapped? Because I did a project once trying to look at which sidewalks work and which sidewalks don't for a variety of people, and that information is not really available.
Yeah, you're totally right. Like I would say sidewalks are both sometimes like the most studied from an urbanist perspective and like the least standardized from a disability perspective. So there's like so much stuff about, you read like Jane Jacobs and everybody who loves Jane Jacobs about like, sidewalks should be wide to encourage people to interact and these sorts of things. Disabled people historically have done a lot of activism around sidewalks, curb cuts, and things like, how to remove barriers from sidewalks. Where I live, we still have power lines that are on poles that just stick out in the middle of the sidewalk. So most of them are inaccessible in terms of mobility. But then, municipalities tend to have their own kind of regulations, and even like districts have their own regulations for the construction of sidewalks. And so it creates all sorts of issues. And, the people I think who do the most advocacy around sidewalks are kind of like pedestrian, like bike walk advocate kinds of folks. And there aren't always good relationships between walk bike advocates and disability advocates, because there's so much emphasis on like activity and movement and getting going, and not so much on like sitting and resting and being able to access the sidewalks in the first place. So I definitely agree with you. It's like an area to examine more, and there's so many ways to do it. One of the projects that we did with Mapping Access was creating a network map of the Vanderbilt campus sidewalks so that we could quantify how much longer it takes to get from point A to point B if you take the accessible route versus the inaccessible route. And accessible in this case was like, are there stairs? Are there tree roots sticking out of the paths? Like things like that. So there's so many different dimensions that you could go through with that, even if you're only focusing on mobility. And then if you're bringing in like wayfinding and navigation, like that adds like a whole other layer.
Yeah, the only mapping online that I found that was available to just the general public was called OpenStreetMaps, which is completely crowdsourced. And so the sidewalks are only mapped where somebody has gone and mapped them. So it was like a very frustrating project to try and work through. We have a question from Kara. What is your approach with groups that want to make their spaces accessible by the government regulations and standards? And what are some approaches to support them to expand beyond the code?
Yeah, so I mean, the typical approaches to meeting government regulations are things like ADA audits, and there are people who specialize in that and how to meet the code. And, you know, I would say that there are way more like typologies and kind of like types of designs that you could adapt more readily, for example, like around bathrooms that exist meet the code than to go beyond it. But then anytime you're trying to go beyond something that's a standard, you have to ask like who it's supposed to benefit. Like what's the purpose of going beyond? Is it to add in more groups of people that are not represented by the ADA? Is it to make types of access that the ADA promises more effective for the people who are covered by it? And all of these are really different. So as one example, like the building that I showed that had the staircase at the center, that does go beyond the code because the ADA doesn't require that you build a whole new building to put in accessible circulation. However, it doesn't necessarily take a disability culture approach. And I think one of the only ways to do that is really to involve disabled people and also get more disabled people in architecture schools and to, you know, be practicing architects. And there's still so many barriers to that. There are some other projects that are really interesting in terms of going beyond the code. So Joel Sanders at Yale has this design firm called Mix, and they basically they design bathrooms that are both trans inclusive and disability inclusive. And it's really, really interesting because they're kind of trying to create a typology that can be replicated in different places and still have kind of like everything that would be needed. So if you want to ask those kinds of questions, you kind of have to ask like why are you doing it and who you're trying to be accountable toward as well.
Yeah, the idea of including, needing to include more disabled people in architecture school came up last week as well, and the understanding how to queer design education. Like we need more queer people in architecture school.
Yeah, totally. I mean, architects are not starting with a super diverse standard of the human, so there's so many ways to expand that.
There's another question by Marisabel. It asks, how does the current research on ableism and physical accessibility interrelate with the cognitive transformations associated with ageism?
That's a great question. So there has been There's been research on accessibility and aging pretty much just as long as there has been on kind of physical mobility access, often by some of the same people. So those rehab engineers I was talking about in the 50s and 60s, they were also doing research on what happens to bodies as they age, what happens to people's like wayfinding, if they have like Alzheimer's or dementia. And there's tons of research about that stuff. But it tends to really focus on institutional settings like hospitals and nursing homes, and not so much on public access, because the political part, which is like how to get people out of nursing homes or how to get people out of institutions, isn't like married to the very functional approaches to cognitive access yet. And so I think that that's an area that all the people who are disability activists who are saying like nursing homes are terrible places and people should have access to like community are the same people who are saying like access should be centered in public space and not so privatized. But you can read so much like in the neuroscience of architecture about how folks are thinking about like spatial planning and design in relation to like age-related cognitive changes. John Eberhard is like one person who writes.
Yes, I love him so much. We have a comment and a question from Hairi. It says, thank you very much for this great lecture. It's clear that architecture education has been founded on ableist biases. It has universal expectations from both able and disabled bodies. Moreover, the success is evaluated through performance and productivity. How can we intervene in architectural curriculum to accommodate disabled students?
This is such an important question. And I think that it's like the question that goes way beyond admissions policies and things like that. Like, obviously, there are reasons why students may not be admitted to architecture schools because of disability that may be evident or not evident. Like, maybe the building's not accessible, or maybe they like have an undiagnosed learning disability that affects their grades or something like that. But like, I did not go to architecture school, but from what I know about it, it is pretty intense, and there are a lot of expectations about like the number of hours you spend working in the studio, and what kinds of like physical and mental like longevity or stuff. And I think that that's a question. This same exact question is also being asked about like pre-med education or any kind of like really type of education that understands itself to be very rigorous. And there's so much that we can learn from disability culture about slowness as a form of rigor, that actually slowing down, taking care of ourselves, valuing care, and building in accessibility can actually produce better outcomes than just like trying to weed people out or trying to rush everyone through things. In the case of like a standardized curriculum, that may mean like letting people take longer or taking fewer credit hours or building in more forms of access for everyone. Right now during COVID, so many people are using forms of access like, online digital learning that before would have been a disability accommodation. And so like continuing to build those things in, doing asynchronous. Those are just some ideas, but I think that there are there's so much to investigate further with this.
Yeah, my friends in the disabled community and disability activists were saying about how during the pandemic we were very quickly able to switch our work and make it accessible. Their comment was, it wasn't that it was difficult before, it was just that you didn't care to make it available to us. Fully valid. Yeah. We have a question. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Hamraie. You mentioned the difference between ADA goals and disability justice goals. How can we incentivize clients to focus on these justice goals when current requirements don't necessarily do enough?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I was talking to an architect yesterday about this because, the disability justice goals are not always aligned with the goals of clients, because clients may be like real estate developers or like people who may not be on board with anti-capitalism, and so some of the differences are more in terms of like how expansively we think about disability, for example, or the issue of access. Um, Thinking about the concept of cross-movement organizing in disability justice, you could translate that into how does it benefit multiple types of marginalized people to do X? How can we make sure to engage meaningfully with potential users and to allocate the appropriate amount of time to do that? I think you can say those things and ask those questions without necessarily like having to say like, do you want to abolish capitalism, or do you want to adopt an intersectional framework? If that's not like language that they're using necessarily. And also to just know that like people who have a lot of money to pay for you to design a building may not have those same values necessarily, and that's okay as long as you're incorporating them in the way that you do your work.
We have another question. It is an incipit, so it can take a bit. Bear with me. Thank you for a fine. It comes from Jude LeBlanc. Thank you for a fine overview of the issue. I attended a lecture many years ago, I imagine, by Dean Peckham, the product designer that invented the Segway. In a very inspirational talk, he said he was inspired to start his project as an alternative to addressing ADA challenges by architecture alone. He designed the Segway and also a wheelchair that could move up vertically to give the user height and might even climb stairs with aid of gyroscopes. Do you know of other technological, especially computational, mobile, or electronic innovations that might similarly solve accessibility issues, as an addition to expensive spatial or major spatial retrofits?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of disability activists would maybe push back against the idea that those kinds of like stair climbing wheelchairs and things like that actually improve access, because they tend to do it on an individual basis. And so the question is like, who should bear the financial burden of access? Is it like government and institutions, universities, maybe cities that have that funding, or individual people who may be like independently wealthy or very not wealthy, may have health insurance, may not have health insurance? And the worry is that like if we put a lot of focus on kind of individual level interventions, then that may let institutions off the hook at a larger scale for creating access, because they'll just be like, oh, well, we don't have to add this elevator because your wheelchair can just climb the stairs. And there are kind of questions about whether it's possible for most, for example, people who are wheelchair users to access something like that kind of technology. So that's like one way of thinking about it. Another is that there are so many types of technologies that are created initially for disabled people that get integrated into the mainstream, that first create disability access, but then start to remove access barriers for other people as well. Captioning, voice-to-text technology, even like maps that have turn-by-turn directions. There have been lots of people developing that kind of thing for blind people's navigation for a long time, but now it's like voiced and ready kind of like in an iPhone or whatever. And in that case, that scale issue in terms of like institutional or corporate responsibility comes back up, because some people may say it increases access for more people to have it integrated into an app as opposed to like an assistive device that you have to get covered by your insurance. And other people may ask the question of like, okay, like, but why are these assistive devices so expensive? And why are there access barriers to getting them in the first place? So I guess my answer to your question is really just kind of like a reframe a little bit. Because if the goal is to create access for as many people as possible, we have to kind of think about like which designs achieve that on a mass scale, and then which ones are kind of more available just for certain people.
Yeah, that's kind of like the idea that corporations put the problem of plastic on the consumer, right? The consumer needs to recycle instead of the instead of the corporation needs to stop using plastic. All right, thank you so much. I don't want to take the entirety of everyone's evening. I could be here all night talking about this stuff. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, Dr. Aimi. It's been, I'm sure, very enlightening for everyone who's attended. Before we end for the evening, I do want to remind everyone or let everyone know that on Thursday, April 8th at 4 p.m., we will be having a roundtable discussion that will go through the various topics we've talked about during this lecture series and how we can start to impact whether it's architecture education in general or specifically architecture education at Georgia Tech, and how we can re-examine those things. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Hamraie, and yeah.
Thank you, Yusuf, for organizing this. Thank you, Mehmet, for facilitating as well. It was great to be with y'all. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.